My name is Simon Payaslian. I'm the holder of the Genocide chair here at Boston University. The Genocide chair was established in 2007, and I'm extremely pleased to see Elizabeth Genocian here. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thanks for coming. I'm just extremely honored that this is the first lecture in the series in modern Armenian history and literature. And I'm thrilled to say that Professor Russell is our first speaker in this series. But before I introduce him, I would like to have Mr. Mark Mamigonian to come and say a couple of words on behalf of Nasser. Just by way of introduction, Mr. Mark Mamigonian, he's a directly related cousin of Vartan Mamigonian. Except Mark is much taller than Vartan Mamigonian. I couldn't resist that one. Mr. Mamigonian is the director of academic affairs at Nasser. He has actually taught courses on James Joyce at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education since 1997. Yeah, he received his master's in English literature at Tufts University. He has published an edited volume entitled Armenians of New England, Celebrating a Culture and Preserving a Heritage, that was published in 2004, and is the author and co-author of several scholarly articles on Joyce. Mark is currently serving as Vice President of Society for Armenian Studies. Mark, would you like to say a couple of words?
And I spent 2 years of my life across the street working, writing annotations to James Joyce's Ulysses in another lifetime, or so it seems now. It's a real pleasure to be here to say a few words on behalf of NASER, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, inasmuch as NASER in the 1950s initiated the permanent study of Armenian subjects, of Armenian studies in the United States, in creating the first chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard University, the chair of which Professor Russell, our speaker, is currently the occupant, which set in motion a whole series of events in the world of Armenian studies in this country, the most recent of which has been the creation of the last chair to date in Armenian studies in the United States, the Genocide chair here at Boston University. So we have the current occupant of the first chair and oldest chair and the current occupant of the newest chair in one room. And it's great that we have a rich and active Armenian studies community here in this country and right here in the Boston area. And we're delighted to help with this collaborative effort. And that's really all I wanted to say is it's an honor to be here and to say thank you to Simon Payaslian and to James Russell for what will be a terrific evening. So I'll turn it back over to Simon.
Okay, I'm just thrilled that I'm introducing Professor James Russell. Professor Russell is Mashlus Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard University. He's been teaching there since 1992. Prior to his appointment at Harvard, Professor Russell taught at Columbia University, and he was Lady Davis Fellow and Visiting Associate Professor of Armenian and Ancient Iranian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Professor Russell is the author of several books, including Zoroastrianism in Armenia, Hovannes Tulkarantsi and Medieval Armenian Lyric Tradition, Heroes of Kasht, an Armenian epic, The Book of Flowers, and I think it was the last one Bosphorus Nights, the complete lyrics of Bedros Turian, in addition to numerous articles on different aspects of Armenian culture, Iranian culture, mythology, and so on. And a collection of them appeared in a volume entitled Armenian and Iranian Studies. At Harvard, Professor Russell offers courses in classical and modern Armenian language, on the Armenian epic of Sassoon, on the writings of the mystic poet Saint Gregory of Narek, and on the folk beliefs and practices of the Armenian people. It is my great pleasure to introduce you, Professor Russell.
very grateful to Professor Payaslian and to Boston University for welcoming me to Versailles Palace. I'm not used to such fancy surroundings, but it's very, very kind, and I hope the lecture justifies the venue. Misak Medzarents, an Armenian poet, wrote in Western Armenian, dates 1886 to 1908. Was born in the village of Binkian, north of Malatya and Agan, in the farthest west of historical Armenia, where the Euphrates River bends wide and lazily west on its course, south to Mesopotamia, was the Hittite province of Melit Kamanu that the ancient Greeks came to call Melitene, with a typical ene ending for a foreign name. It is the people whom they referred to as the Melitenioi, the people of Melitene, or later Malatya, who were perhaps the first speakers of the language we know as Armenian, moving over what was to be the country's ultimate western boundary, the Euphrates River, as Proverbs have it, they sought the rising of the sun. The city, now called Malatya, with a town of Akan nearby, remained as the traditional Euphrates boundary between Roman and Parthian, then Byzantine and Sasanian spheres of influence. Within its bend was the Armenian kingdom of Tsopk, or Sophene, often called Lesser Armenia, or Armenia IV, and the mountain fastnesses north of Kharpert and south of Yerzinka, Erzincan, called Dersim, which never submitted to any alien conqueror and is still in revolt against the central government today. Centuries later, and for long ages, till the baptized armies of Tirdat the Great destroyed it, sometime in the second decade of the 4th century, the Temple of Aramas, father of the gods of the pantheon of the Armenians' national faith, rose over the cliffs of the western Euphrates, in Armenian the Aradzani River, at Ani Kamach, to the north and east. Somewhat eastward on the slopes of Mount Sepuch, in the hills ringing the plain of Erzinca, the Arsacid prince who had brought the faith, Gregory the Illuminator, was spending his last days as a hermit in prayer, when Tirdat, as the legend says, appeared at the cave entrance of his hermitage and held out the magic Havluni sword to the saint. Gregory raised his hand, and the weapon of death, turning downwards in the shape of the cross, the contrivance of life, entered the stone to await the future king. And that's where we get the legend, ladies and gentlemen, inter alia, of the sword and the stone. The Parthian dynasty that had ruled Armenia for nearly half a millennium fell in 429, but its blood flowed in the veins of the great Nakharar noblemen and the Pahlavuni Catholicoi. A generation after the fall, the Nakharar Vartan and the priest Revond Yeretz shed that blood to preserve the new faith against the Sasanian Persians' evangelistic onslaught. And in 775, the last Mamikonian generals, although not the last of the line, took their stand against a newer enemy and conqueror, the Muslim Arab Caliphate. In the century that followed, two surviving Nakharar, that is, noble houses, the Bagratids and Artsrunids, Bakratuni and Artsruni, succeeded in carving out kingdoms in the north and south of Armenia. But in the early 11th century, the diplomatic and military balancing act that had enabled Armenians to retain a measure of their ancient autonomy faltered. The successes of Byzantine campaigns against the Abbasid Caliphate in the south enabled the Emperor Basil II to turn his full attention to the absorption of Armenia within the Byzantine Empire. In 1021, Sennacherib Artsruni, the last of his line, ceded his kingdom, Vaspuragan, to the empire and moved with 14,000 retainers to the west of Armenia to Sepastia, modern Sivas, and in 1045, Byzantium annexed the great Bagratid capital, Ani, on the Araxes River in the northeast of the country. The Armenians, as they moved westwards, even transferred the sacred relics of saints to these new appanages. The monastery of Narek, on the southern shore of Lake Van, for example, was refounded near Sivas at Divrichi, or Tefrike. St. Gregory of Narek, the great mystical poet of the 10th century, had lived on the lake shore and later in a mountain cave in Vaspuragan. But as a boy, the poet Misak Medzarents, who was an avid reader of the Narek and whose influence we'll trace in his poetry, was to go on pilgrimage from his native village of Pinkyan to the newly founded western shrine of the saint, which had become a holy place to the Armenians of this far western area. By the 19th century, it had lost its initial N and was called Arekavank instead of Narekavank. But these shifts of Armenian population centers and power back towards the lands through which the remotest bearers of their speech had come in immemorial antiquity turned to panicked flight after the Seljuk Turks shattered the forces of Romanos Digenis at Manasgert in 1071. But Armenians remained, in numbers, in the fastnesses of their own land for another millennium. Even the city of Ani continued to prosper, even to expand under Seljuk domination and under the Zaccharid dynasty, Christian Zacharids, and a class of powerful merchants called Medzadun, literally great houses, grew alongside the ancient Nakharar nobility. This is important because I'm going to propose presently that the name Medzaduryan, which is the name under which Misak Medzarents was born, is in fact a deformation of the word Medzadun. However, the Armenian highland was never to know freedom under Christian kings again. Legend has it that one of the retainers of Sennacherib Artsruni, a man named Benjamin, or Benik for short, fortified a place called Hrabat, Arabic for town, Rabat, on the banks of the Aratsani River in the far west. A chronicler from nearby Ani Kamach, the place where Aramaz's temple once stood, Grigor Daranachtsi, came in the early years of the 17th century to the village, by now called Ben Khan, after the long-dead Prince Benik, and wrote this: Abba Yelyalantit, Ganatsaki Ben Kanivank, Arak Yev Dadaretsakanten, Voram Rotzer, Yev Martik Badras Moch Untem, Hapshtagoch Ani Iravats. Leaving there, we went to Benkan, to the monastery. We stayed on in that place, which was a fortress, and the men, fighters against lawless marauders. Grigor Daranachtsi spent the year 1611 there and began to copy a Bible. He finished copying other books there as well. So it was a place of learning as well as a fortified place. In July 1878, so 2 centuries later, the Armenian ethnographer Garekin Servanstians visited the village, which was now called either Penka or Pinkyan. In Western Armenian, the word Benik becomes Penig, so Pinkyan, the village where Misak Medzarents was to be born. It was almost entirely Armenian in population in 1878, and still the brave and free enclave that Grigor Daranachtsi had evoked 2 centuries earlier. It had about 1,000 inhabitants, 3 churches, a monastery, 5 teachers in 2 schools serving 150 boy and girl pupils. Girls went to school there since the 1840s, who learned, amongst other subjects, English and French. He reported that every home had books on its shelves, and the village received newspapers and journals from Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and abroad. More important, the village retained and defended much of its ancient freedom. The spoken language was Armenian, not Armeno-Turkish, as it had become the case in so many other parts of the homeland, and Pinkyan even minted its own coins, marked in Armenian script, which were accepted in the village and in other towns for the purposes of local trade. The men of the village were excellent fast horsemen who raised stallions, bore arms, and struck terror into would-be Kurdish marauders and rapists. No Muslim dared even look at an Armenian woman. On the landward side, the village nestled between the slopes of two mountains, Khachmech and Sosik. The first means something like a cross is within, and presumably had a shrine. The second, little plane tree, Sosi, refers to the giant ancient shade tree of traditional village squares, by the rustling of whose thousands of leaves the ancient Armenians used to practice divination. A famous and very unusual bridge, which is in your splendid handouts, or in volumes actually, spanned the Aratsani River. The engraving comes from Yeprikyan's Benashcharik Bararan. And there's also a map of this whole region in the handout. The bridge could be raised in time of trouble and was closed with iron gates every night. So Pinkyan was very thoroughly defended. The villagers were mostly farmers, although they also traveled to the capital. Many were educated in several languages, as I mentioned, and they raised silkworms. One poem by Medzarents, Sherami Eraza, What the Silkworm Dreams, was obviously inspired by the later craft. The people of Pinkyan successfully resisted the first wave of Muslim Kurd marauders sent to kill them by the Ottoman government during the massacres of 1895. But a second larger attack the next year devastated the village, with survivors fleeing into the mountains or to large cities. As I mentioned, most had traveled to the capital at one time or another, and in general had relatives with whom to stay. And it seems that some of the villagers returned after 1896, for Pinkyan, repopulated, defied the order of deportation in 1915, according to the memorial volume of Agen, and ended its 1,000-year life in a last stand of self-defense. The principal clan of the village was the Medzadurian family, who lived in 66 houses clustered around a stone Ivan, a vaulted palace-like structure on the mountainside. When Servanstians visited there, 8 years before the birth of our poet, one of the Medzadurians was the village headman, the mudir. According to one tradition, the family were descended from the Meliks of Karabakh, that is to say, descendants of the ancient Nakharars. These proud warlike mountaineers had for centuries retained a measure of independence on the eastern edge of Greater Armenia and formed the nucleus of the uprising of David Beck in 1722, the time of the first real stirrings of the modern Armenian liberation movement. According to Vahan Arslanyan, a relative of Misak Medzarents, the Medzadurians had not come from Karabakh, but from Ani, from the Bagratid capital. This migration would probably have happened in the 13th or 14th century. And if his supposition is true, then the family name may indeed be understood as a deformation of the term Metzatun, the merchant princes of the medieval Bagratid metropolis. So it is more than likely that the early Medzadurians, who made the long trek from one end of historical Armenia to the other, were a noble and martial lot who chose a famed place where the old freedoms survived. In January of 1886, Iskuhi, born Avakian, Metzaturian, bore a son, Misak, to her husband, Garabed Agha. The latter, like many villagers, moved to the capital to work, and Misak was to join him in September 1902 and Galata, but we'll get there. A monastery dedicated to the three youths in the fiery furnace of the Book of Daniel, the Yeritz Mangans, stood in Pinkyan, and Misak bears the Armenian form of the name of the middle one of these, Meshech, Shadrach, Meshech, Abednego. Yeah? Shadrach becomes Armenian Setrak, which is still a fairly common name. I've never met anyone named Abednego. These are Cappadocian names, however, and thus they were probably considered to be local saints. Misak was the youngest child of the family, with two elder brothers and a sister. We know quite a lot about the brothers, a lot less about the sister. Gevorg had left the village and become a prominent lawyer and journalist in Sepastia, Sivas, and for a time Misak and his mother were to join him. But the poet spent his first 9 years in the village, where, it is reported, he was a somewhat inattentive schoolboy who loved going out into the fields and woods and listening to the shepherd's flute, the sering, when the herds were driven home. Sometimes he went out to the nighttime irrigation of the fields, the churduk, with a kinsman, and loved to ride at a gallop behind the saddle on the way back. He would go to the spring of Zag to hunt butterflies. On one of his lonely rambles, he met a bear. The villagers went on pilgrimages into the mountains, into the Menzur Mountains, like Narek, in the countryside, and Misak joined these. He also loved the village love songs and lyrics, which are called sher, from the Arabic for poem, sher, and haren, from hayeren, meaning simply Armenian poem, a genre for which the medieval bard Nahabed Kuchak was famous. And he listened with rapt attention also to the recitation of hekyats, traditional folk tales. His mother, Iskuhi, was a pious Christian, and her devotions and incense burning on Saturday nights made a strong impression on him, and this is echoed throughout his poems. He knew quite a lot of the Armenian divine liturgy, and it serves as a source for some of his work, particularly the Arevagal, the Sunrise Office, and the Chorhurt Chorin, the Hymn of Vesting. I'll speak about these presently. And he also seems to have known intimately all of the Narek, the Madyan Vochpergutyan, the Book of Lamentations of St. Gregory, Subgrigor Narekatsi, St. Gregory of Narek. I've dwelt at some length on Misak's early childhood, and at even greater length on his origins and background, in order to dispel the possible impression that one often has when studying poets, that he was a country bumpkin who escaped what Marx rather unkindly termed the idiocy of rural life to lead a short but brilliant career. He died of consumption at 22, after all, in the big city Constantinople, and it was coming to Constantinople where his life really took off. Rather to the contrary, and this is what I thought when I began studying him, but rather to the contrary, his earliest and most powerful memories were of an almost magical realm, where Armenians, armed and virile, not at all the Raya people that they were supposed to be under Turkish rule, unbowed by centuries of Ottoman domination, lived in freedom in the midst of a flourishing traditional culture that was augmented by contemporary European learning and enlightenment. So it was a happy childhood that infuses his memories and shapes his verses. It's unusual for writers, a happy childhood, yes? We're used to them complaining ad nauseum about their traumas. This is the opposite. Medzarents' language is extraordinarily rich, and it wasn't acquired simply in Constantinople, but in a town that had since 1021 been a stronghold of the Armenian language. Yeah? Its classical elements are not stilted and bookish, as one often finds in the writings of people subjected to the Mechitarist version of classical Armenian, but naturally flowing. His evocations of village life and of nature are vital, not precious and contrived. And that happy childhood in the midst of an accomplished and loving clan, a very large clan, of probable nobility and fabulous antiquity, left in him a deep and indestructible cheerfulness, also somewhat unusual in Armenian literature, that emerges again and again in his work, the sun, as he put it, coming out from behind the clouds. He didn't like the big city that much and was planning, in fact, to return home. In all these respects, he differs quite sharply from the other great young Western Armenian poet of nearly 2 generations before, with whom he's always paired and always compared, Bedros Torren. But paradise was to be lost. Paradise is always lost, which is, I suppose, why we write about it, and that's maybe why we're given the gift of writing in the first place. The reign of the paranoid obscurantist Sultan Abdul Hamid was oppressive enough. It was forbidden to print a long list of words, including things like Hayastan, meaning Armenia, and Azg, meaning nation. But even words like Astr, star, were prohibited since it was suspected that they might just refer to Yıldız Palace. Yıldız is Turkish for star. This was where the Sultan lived, and thus encode a possible assassination plot. When Bingyan was first attacked in 1895, during the first great wave of Muslim massacres of the Armenians under the bloody Sultan, Misak and his mother left. They went to live with his elder brother in Sivas. He studied at the Sahakyan school there, and then in 1898 went to Anatolia College, a boarding school run by American Protestant missionaries in Merzifon, or Marsovan, or Marsvan. There are various ways of pronouncing it. Misak was remembered as slender, melancholy, and a little bashful. He studied English and French, New Verlaine, probably also Baudelaire, maybe Rimbaud, possibly Le Bateau Ivre, I'm hoping he did, The Drunken Boat, for reasons we'll see. He certainly knew Poe, maybe he knew Blake, and he loved Oscar Wilde's writing in particular and wrote a long essay about it. Some Armenian writers at this time had fled abroad, principally to Paris and Cairo, to escape the Hamidian reaction, but their writings in the journals they founded in those places, such as Anahit in Paris, were smuggled in. So Misak read Arshak Chobanyan and Krikor Zohrab, as well as the fin de siècle fare of poets, decadents like Yehia Demirci-Bashian. He read and revered Bedros Torren's lyrics. When he lived in Constantinople, he went to the cemetery of Bağlarbaşı in Üsküdar, Scutari, to visit the poet's grave, and he wrote a tribute inspired by Wilde's elegy of Shelley. In a later critical essay on the writings of Archbishop Yehia Torren, who was then the abbot of Armash Monastery, which became the home of the Charchapan Surpas Vazazin painting. It's still there, in fact. There's a copy in my neighborhood in Upper Manhattan at Surpach. So I don't know, has anyone ever seen it? Yeah, I often go to look at it, but you could see it there. It's on East 187th Street, or in Armash. The Turks won't let it out. Anyway, Archbishop Torren, who was Bedros Torren's younger brother, he was born Mihran, was the abbot there. He was a considerable poet and writer and a great scholar. And Medzarents, in an essay on him, observes that this is who Bedros, who died of consumption at age 21, might have become had he lived longer. This becomes a leitmotif. What might they have become had they lived longer? Life in the large provincial towns in the late 1800s was still dangerous for Armenians, and Misak's relatives worried about his incessant rambles alone. So in June 1901, he was on his way in Marsvan to visit a sick friend named Nerses, who was to die of consumption 2 years later, when a Turkish butcher's assistant attacked and stabbed him in the shoulder with a knife. Misak had sickened and been close to death at the age of 1 during a severe drought. And though the stab wound healed, it seems permanently to have weakened him. He left Marsvan to join his father in Constantinople the next year, September 1902, and enrolled in the Kedronagan, the Central Armenian School. But he contracted consumption, withdrew from his studies in 1905, devoted himself to writing, and died the night of 21st June in the old style, 4th of July, it would have been in this country that day, in 1908. The attack brought forth Medzarents' first poem called Marmini Verk, Srti Verk, Wounds to the Body, Wounds to the Heart, in 1901. And he wrote regularly thereafter. Soon after his arrival in the capital, he was already publishing poems in Armenian journals such as Arevelian Mamul, using a pen name, Shavasp Dziadzan. Dziadzan means rainbow. And it's the title also of his first published volume of verse, and he encodes this word rainbow, Dziadzan, into a variety of his poems. So he can creep in as a rainbow. You can be what you like in your own poems. Then he shortened his name and nom de plume to Medzarents from Medzadurian. He seems quickly to have shed the remnants of village dialect in everyday speech for the standard literary Western Armenian of Constantinople, with what often seems to me its complex and overblown prose syntax, which owes a great deal to Ottoman. His poems, which were most unfairly compared to the work of the contemporary symbolists, Eastern Armenian criticism always compares him to Vahan Teryan, who was a symbolist living in Petersburg and Moscow, his poems achieved an instant acclaim, and sometimes unfavorable notice as well. Arpiyaryan, no mean critic, attacked him amongst other young poets in an article in Masis in 1902. The same year he arrives in Constantinople, unfairly, even more unfairly, implying a kinship in his work with decadence. Decadence is a movement that Arpiyaryan rightly regarded as unhealthy for the youth of the Armenian nation, since after all it celebrated ill health to start with and encouraged suicide. Several people followed the advice of the decadents, and some of the decadents themselves, and killed themselves. Medzarents had nothing to do with any of it. But he was tarred with the same brush because these people were his friends. He was neither hurt nor passive in his responses to his critics. Striding happily into the arena, he published vigorous defenses of his own work and attacks on the people who had attacked him. We have all of these. He'd made friends in Sivas and Marsovan despite his somewhat retiring nature, and his social circle in the capital expanded, so his satirical poems tend to both mock his critics and gently make fun of his friends. Guilt by association, though, in the criticism is a very imprecise method. The symbolist's creed asserted that exotic colors, misty vistas, nocturnal reveries, and half-heard murmurs, for which you often use words like shashuk or hdzzyunk in Armenian. Armenian's good at words for murmurs, are the delicate and elusive symbols in this world of another, truer and better one. This was very big in Belgium, France, Russia. There were a lot of symbolists around. Medzarents' poems employ all of these elements and strategies, but he in fact cherishes nature, celebrates life, and regards the creator with grateful amazement. He never tries to escape somewhere else. He uses symbolist techniques, but he's not a symbolist at all. And in this regard, he's still remoter from the decadents, whose exploration of the inner world, the nerashchar, of Medzarents' contemporary Tiran Cherakian, who called himself Indra, an anagram of his first name, but also the name of an Indian god, comes to mind. The longing for death, for the grave. Cherakian created a plethora of new compound words in Armenian to express, or as often to conceal, his arcane imaginings. And Medzarents also created many compounds in his work, so he was paired with Cherakian, I think most unfairly. His compounds are strivings to evoke a vividly remembered scene in Pingyan, or color, or a feeling in the world as it actually exists, not as a flight from it. His deep optimism, his cheerfulness in the face of his sickness, and the certainty of an early death seem almost improbable at times, and contrast also with the agonized sorrow of a poet whom he greatly cherished, Bedros Tourian. Like Tourian, though, he worked feverishly towards the end. The volumes Ziadzan, Rainbow, and Nord Dagesh, New Poems, were printed in 1907, a year before he died, and he continued to publish until a month before he passed away. A third volume, Baba Khumnesh, meaning heartbeats, appeared posthumously. All in all, he wrote about 100 poems, give or take a few, roughly twice as many as Bedros Tourian, but then he lived 2 years longer. The year of Misak's death saw the revolutionary overthrow of the Ancien Regime and the installation of the Young Turks. The story is by now familiar. Armenians participated enthusiastically in the new parliament and expressed nationalist aspirations, which they hoped would be fulfilled by an enlightened and secularizing government. The ultra-nationalist Turkish Committee of Union and Progress, however, especially after the Balkan War, in which Turkey lost the Greek port city of Salonika and most of what was left of its European territories, regarded the Armenians as a dangerous alien element, and one in the Anatolian heartland itself. To be eliminated from the political life of the empire, their economic role radically to be curtailed, their physical presence to be either extirpated or reduced to insignificance. So in 1915, with the Great War half reason and half pretext, Turkey murdered or deported most of the Armenians from their homeland. Only starving refugees or the Armenians living in the eastern sliver of the country under Russian rule remained alive, and some in the capital, where the genocide at first was aimed only at intellectuals and leaders. The Turks and Kurds destroyed whatever Armenian monuments were left standing, and the post-war fascist state founded by Mustafa Kemal expelled the few Armenians who had trickled back to the ruins of their old homes, while changing the names of towns and villages in an effort retroactively to eradicate the Armenian past. Armenia did not exist. It had never existed. This Orwellian campaign of mass murder that the Turks had called a jihad at the time, the Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin was to coin the term genocide to give a name to what had been done to Armenia only in the 1940s, in the midst of the massacre of his own people, was a civil war, they said, or resistance to a fifth column fighting for the Russians, or just one of those tragedies that happen sometimes. I feel it's worth mentioning here that the latest iteration of Turkish denial, this ought to be said in public, is the approach of the journalist Ece Temelkuran, who's made something of a noise in Boston and around the States recently, who works for the newspaper Hürriyet and in Constantinople and overtly refuses to study the events. She professes no interest at all in what actually happened, but wants to view the present situation in terms of a perverse Gestalt psychology, whereby Armenians and Turks both suffer from trauma, but especially the Armenians, whose greater trauma suggests only that they are frozen in infantile complexes. Christopher Debeleg, who was stung by my accusation of his Holocaust denial when he presented something similar in the New York Review of Books, characterizing the genocide as an overreaction by their Ottoman fellow citizens, if you please, to Armenian rioting, has written a slim volume recently peddling a similarly psychoanalgesic anti-history. And another dilettante, Roger Cohen of the New York Times, applauds this and calls for historians, and I'm not making this up, to be more vague. If there were some intellectual content to all of this, it might be dismissed as a sort of recherche joke about the misty imagery of symbolist poetry. Vagueness, you know, but there isn't. Medzarents published his poetic statement, his Ars Poetica, in Sharpetsutiamp, with what intoxication, which we'll look at presently. It's going to be a long evening. In Arevelian Mamul, on August 1st, 1907, less than a year before his death, in the midst of his own sickness, with a dedication to his friend, the poet and prose writer Geram Parserian, whom he had met in the offices of the journal Surhantak, the Courier, 2 years before. So you check the dates. Who was Parserian? I thought I could avoid having to look at it, but Christian Millian over there asked me, who is he? When did he live? So I did my homework. He lived 1883 to 1915, and he was a writer, critic, editor. 3 years Misak senior. They'd been friends for only 2 years. As I said, they met in 1905, and he was murdered in the Genocide. This death knell of the year 1915 rings in every biography of every friend and every contemporary. Taniel Varujan, Sia Manto, Krikor Zorab. There's absolutely no doubt that after perhaps a few more volumes of verse, Medzarents, just shy of his 30th birthday, perhaps married by then, he never had a girlfriend. People lived modest lives in those days. He wrote about love, but it was speculative. Perhaps married with a son or daughter, or and daughter, to whom he sang the songs and chanted the tales of Pingyan, where he'd been planning to go to collect folklore, he said. Maybe he would have made it back there and brought God knows what oral treasures. Still, he would have been dragged from his home on April 24th, 1915, tortured, and then shot or bludgeoned to death and dumped in an unmarked mass grave. He avoided that by dying at 22. But even so, Misak was one of the Abrilyan Nahadagner, the martyrs of April 1915, wasn't he? Just avant la lettre, before the fact. The Turkish thug with his butcher's knife, the wound to the body that was really a wound to the soul. And the exile, ever westward, out of the village, across the Euphrates, to Sivas, to Marsavan, to Constantinople, fleeing the civil danger that threatened the Armenians, away from the home of the sun, into the dark, into the nowhere, left to go, that the Muslims and the world thrust the Armenians into, and then it was over. But the great world grinds on, doesn't it always? In 1917, the Caucasian front, back in the east, collapsed as the Russians left to fight their various revolutions, and Turkey pressed on to try to kill the rest of the Armenians, including the refugees from the mass slaughter, who were left on the plain of Ararat and in the mountains of Karabakh. But the mills for once stalled. In 1918, General Andranik's citizen army beat back the invading Turks, 5 armies, from Alexandropol. They had conquered it briefly. This is Gyumri. This is the second city of Armenia. I don't know if everybody here is Armenian or not, but for those who aren't. It was the second largest city, and it was captured briefly, and the Turks began killing people there. And then there was just the plain of Ararat and Yerevan, the last place left. Intellectuals from Tiflis, refugees from Van and Kars, forged a short-lived republic. It lasted 2 years, and then began in the new USSR of the 1920s to build something called Soviet Armenia. The young revolutionary poet, Yehishe Charents, my favorite poet, who became general editor of the Transcaucasian Publishing House, vowed to print editions of the Western Armenian poets Turyan and Medzarents, despite the fact that their reputation as bourgeois or even decadent had made them slightly less than respectable amongst revolutionary Soviet critics. He was still profoundly influenced by them and vowed to publish them. And he did. In 1934, the state publishing house, the Bedagan Radaragchutun in Yerevan, published an edition of the complete works of Misak Medzarents, edited by Charents, and illustrated, beautifully illustrated. The title page is in your booklet, by Khachvankian, with a fine glossary and an introduction of some 50 pages, prepared jointly by the Soviet Armenian writers Alazan and Vaharshag Norents. According to the Great Green Soviet Armenian Encyclopedia, Alazan, whose real name was Vahram Kapuzyan, was born at Van in 1903, fled to Russian Armenia during the Genocide, served as secretary of the Union of Soviet Armenian Writers, and editor of the literary paper Kragan Tert until 1936, and published a volume of reflective essays, Horizons, in 1957. Just a gap there. Keep in mind. Vaharshag Norents, a better-known writer and a close friend of Charents, pursued a career with a similarly strange empty bit between 1936 and the early 50s, something like a donut hole. Yeah? Soviet writers basically had either a lucky donut hole or else just it ended. I don't know. To pursue the metaphor, the Danish was cut in half. And the terminal line is the year 1937. Soon after the publication of the 1934 edition, another one came out with the same date, but no editorial page mentioning Charents, who was a non-person, you see, and no introduction, and the reference to the latter in the table of contents, which was at the back, Russian style, was neatly blacked out. Medzarents' brother poets, mind you, people who'd already survived the first bit of the 20th century, had been erased by Stalin's Great Purge in 1937 from history. We can list about 250 known Armenian writers who were killed in 1937. This was a list given by the Armenian Weekly in the 50s. And Charents, the greatest poet ever to write in the Eastern dialect of modern Armenian, was arrested in 1937, and on a dark night in November of that year, he was taken from his jail cell in his pajamas, shot in the back of the head, and dumped in an unmarked pit across the Hrazdan River from central Yerevan by the KGB. One genocide had not been enough. In 1954, however, Anastas Mikoyan used to be a household name in America when I was a boy. He was in the Politburo, and legend has it that he actually talked to American Armenians working for the federal government, and that helped avert a nuclear war once upon a time. Yeah, He was usually the bearer of good news. He flew to Yerevan bearing the order that the banned poets be rehabilitated and published. The statue of Stalin was removed, and Mother Armenia, with her sword in hand, rose over the capital city. Prevented by the censorship from speaking openly of his nation's hopes, Medzarents may be attempted in his verses to do the very thing his critics were unable to see and still haven't noticed: to imagine a free and empowered life, a life spoken in Armenian alone, lived peacefully on one's own soil, steeped in the images and sounds of an ancient, unbroken tradition, joined harmoniously to the world culture of the age. This was a vision that was unencumbered by the lachrymose paradigm, as Salo Baron used to refer to Jewish history. Basically, let's have a good cry about our past, of defeat, suffering, and martyrdom, whose final expressions were escapism and decadence. Medzarents is a point in a remarkably rapid development of modern Armenian literature. He died only a bit over a half-century after Khachatur Abovyan's first vernacular Armenian novel, Verkayastani. And a strip of Armenian land, the Khanate of Yerevan, had been wrested from Muslim rule for the first time since the fall of the Cilician kingdom in 1375, only 20 years before Abovian wrote his novel. And Medzarents was only the second poet of real importance to write in the common vernacular Armenian of modern times that most of his nation spoke. And this was a time when oppressed peoples in general were reviving themselves. It's exactly 5 years after Abovian's Verkayastani that the first modern Hebrew novel was written, Ahavat Zion by Avraham Mapu. 5 years before Misak's birth, 5 years, a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda moved from Poland to Jerusalem to raise the first Hebrew-speaking child on the soil of the land of Israel in 2 millennia. And as the young Medzarents was moving from town to town and school to school, a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl witnessed the anti-Semitic fiasco of the Dreyfus trial and forged Zionism. Two peoples whose talent, energy, and economic advancement excited envy, whose lack of political and military power excited contempt, a deadly mixture. And even as both struggled to create a normal life in a land they might call their own, events overtook them. The genocide, then the Holocaust. And in 1953, at least Stalin dies. In 1957, this time under the editorship of Daronsi, Medzarents' Yergerijo Vadzu, his collected works, is printed yet again in Armenia, with the introduction by Alazan and Norentz restored, though abridged to about a third of its original length. So Soviet Armenians could cherish again their entire national heritage. The great poet Parur Savak, published in 1971, which was the year of his own young and untimely death, the critical edition of Bedros Turyan's work, the only one. The superb authoritative study and edition of the complete works of Medzarents by Albert Sharuryan, the great unsung hero of the study of Western Armenian literature, comes in 1981. So as Misak used cheerfully to affirm, the rain is the harbinger of a clear day. And the work has survived, with the tenacity of the little village clinging to its steep mountainsides above the Aradzani through the surging flood of time. In the West, one often speaks with leisure of either the perfection of the life or the perfection of the work, as though there were a choice. But for Armenian literature, life tends to be perilous, defiant, and is a gift all by itself if it lasts long enough for the work even to be done. So let's turn now to the poems. The first I would like to examine, which you have the Armenian texts in your booklet, is Gaidzer, Sparks, a perfect small example of Medzarents' poetic and thematic intricacy and loveliness, his intertextuality. I'll read my English translation. The drumbeat of my soul, its tambourines trill, this night descend in laughter. Like cymbals clashing, they delight, my memories clap their hands together. Accompanying the lute's song, your falcon eyes flame, purple born, and fire burns within my soul again. Drunken on that intangible ambrosia with kisses redolent of flowers, sway there in mad dances, the regal ladies' undulations. The dark night gently wears away. Oh, just once more, just once again, my soul intoxication craves in the rivulets of fire flowing from your gaze. The first stanza introduces in Armenian a rhythmic pattern of musical sound with the words tap u tumbugi, meaning tambourine and drum. There's an actual percussive beat, tap, tumb, like that, tap, tum, right, with a soundless, so a voiceless and voiced drum beat. Yeah? And then there's follows a cadence of alliterative patterns. Dzidzach, laughter. Tzunzcha, cymbal. Tzunzun, joyful. With zap, clapping. in the final line, rounding out the pattern and recapitulating the sound pattern of tap at the beginning. Okay? So this is sound. The second stanza moves from the sense of sound, which is so densely evoked, to that of sight, from sound to color, and introduces various allusions to ancient visions rather than alliteration. The musical instrument pampir in the first line, which Narragazi actually uses, by the way, in a prayer to the holy Muron, the holy chrism, reminds one at once of panturen, an other ancient Armenian word for a musical instrument. And Movses Khorenatsi, in his History of the Armenians, declares that he heard with his own ears the bards, the gusans, singing of the birth of the fiery-haired Vahagan from a flaming reed in the purple sea, Zovan Zirani. And the stanza mentions fire 3 times, calling it Ziranedzin. So there is that Z signature, which we've seen from the first stanza. The epithet refers to the ancient song, but it's also a calque, that is to say, a part-by-part literal translation of a Greek word, porphyrogenitus, which is an epithet of the Byzantine emperors and has the sense of noble or regal, to the purple-born. And this meaning is echoed in Persian in the same stanza by the word shaheni, falcon-like, with the Persian name of the noble hunting bird enclosing the word shah, king. The third stanza moves from color to senses of taste, smell, and touch. It begins with ginov, drunk. He likes this word, kinov. And the substance of the intoxication is the touch of a kiss, hambuyr, an ancient Armenian word meaning literally the sharing of a scent. Buyr is the word for a scent. It's the same as the word Buddha, which means awareness in Sanskrit. The scent is dzahganush, flower sweet. But note that both the word nectar he uses and anuish in classical Armenian mean the same thing, ambrosia or drink of immortality. So the stanza then goes on to evoke the lovely erotic motion of the dance, resuming the motif of archaic nobility. Medzarents uses the very ancient Iranian word bambish, Middle Persian bambishan, for queen. So we have an image of the ancient royal courts with the queen dancing. And in the fourth stanza, the fabulous reverie of wild music, undulation, purple-hued fire, mystic intoxication fades, even as the velvet night dark fades, goes to pre-dawn gray, but not without a last potently marked word to remind us of the ecstasy of the vision. The gaze of the beloved is called here Hara Hosan, flowing with fire. This compound is unusual and comes from the hymn of vesting that I mentioned briefly earlier from the Divine Liturgy of the Armenian Church. Antrevadzin pajagra hosan vor hegar harakyalsuni surp vernadanın hech yevi mez hogit surp astvads und padmujani azko zimastutunen. That rain-born cup flowing with fire that you poured into the apostles in the holy cenaculum, pour upon us as well, O Holy Spirit God, your wisdom together with this vestment. So the passage adumbrates a spiritual intoxication, imagined as a cup of fire pouring down like rain, the mystical drunkenness that has infused the poet's soul with both artistic wisdom and sensual delight at the same time. This is where he deploys a lot. There's a briefer poem, Gisherin Yerazanka, What the Night Dreams, which to me recalls William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, in a simplicity that is at first deceptive. In the tenebrous fog dreams the night of the burning cherry lips of daybreak, bright, and then the shining stars of joy all smile upon the gloried lap of heaven's blue delight, but sometimes too in nightmares, deep dawn yawns abyssal, in the nighttime sleep, and after the rude blasts growls and heaves, the rain comes, shedding floods of tears. Here we have two words that create the thematic and phonetic structure about which I spoke in the first poem. The tenebrous fog is in Armenian achchamuch, and it is twinned with muchtsavanj, nightmare, in the first line of the second. So the two compounds, which are phonetically very similar, are brought together. Thus, rain comes even when one dreams of a clear day. Much as in Blake's poems, we have a kind of childlike landscape with a sudden darkness. And the dark day, an inversion of the hope of light, becomes also a spatial inversion in this poem. Dawn does not rise or break, but it yawns. It's called an antunt, a bottomless abyss. So everything's inverted. The language and structure are simple at first glance, and then they're literally disorienting. But Medzarents recovers his strength. He thrusts darkness away. One of his more famous poems, Giankinyerka, the Song of Life, is an example of this. From within life's frightful furrows hissed whispers, interspersed with cries to me. All hopes come but to great vanity. Emptiness seals life's inanity. Every flower by its fading is attended, every life in black shadows ended, and as the incense of the bloom is routed, so vanishes all hope unsprouted. But through my smoldering reveries steals a light of sudden purple bright, the gold, an iridescent lovely song of life, to all of which I listened, trembling. Let not these gloomy lamentations crush you, nor your golden hopes be scattered to the wind. Each furrowed brow is smoothed, a salve to every pain comes in self-forgetful smiles and laughter. Look now, the blue of heaven's canopy by bleary clouds is sometimes stained and smiles wink out. The rain pours down, but tears of rain predict their very end. Our word for rain contains the sun's name as its ending, and crying ends with sunlit smiles, and all the past occasions of our laughing create a long inheritance of happiness. The line Amen anzrev, arev muni irmen verch, literally every rain has a sun after it, I have translated, since it's a play on Armenian, our word for rain contains the sun's name as its ending, stressing the play on Armenian anzrev, rain, and arev, sun. So, literally, the ending of anzrev is arev, as well as figuratively or temporally, and the double meaning of verch is both after and ending. Yeah? In another poem, Irikvantem, Towards Dusk, Medzarents encodes his pen name, Ziadzan, rainbow. Close to voluptuous daybreak, in my slumber I dreamed of the song of life in burning hues festooned and shivering rainbows of silken shimmer stretching, fringe aglow into the other world. Diurnal life's concerns, the maelstrom of enchantment my dreams dispelled, and I saw life close and shorn of manic and deceitful games, savage, wounding pain. Dusk comes, shadows swiftly fall, in vain now morning's reveries I seek, a savage love imbibed the dewdrops of their light, and with my sobbing I remained, all alone and far away. The last two lines of the first stanza enclose the poet's rainbow in an intentional cadence of reduplicative compound words, whose rhythmic doubling in length, the very verb gergarein, they were stretching out, both expresses and also phonetically reflects. Yev toch tochun ziadzaner metak savrech upach padzob gergarein ashcharmantin. But the only phonetic echo that ziadzan, the rainbow, finds as night falls is an encoded word, hedzedzank, also reduplicative, meaning crying. There are two poems, Giragmutk and Chunkyevartzunk, on the eve of Sunday and Incense and Tears, which evoke the poet's mother's evening prayers, and these are suffused with a spiritual calm and express something of his connection to the Armenian church. The first bears the classical Armenian epigraph, "Coming at the setting of the sun, we have beheld this evening's light." And this is the poem. The softly fleeting violet evening light is happiness, golden threads are wreathed in velvet mist of frankincense, blue fringes, rainbow, voices ripple, mystic rose, and as they melt, the shining tears of tapers. My incense-thirsting soul sips the silent moment. As the censers swing their eyes of golden flame, soul-seizing fear, there sets me down unblinking. I sense the kiss, my soul, swathed in sea green. Hues of amethyst, anoint the swirls of incense smoke. On bended knee before the mystery I stand, my arms across, and wait for Sunday brilliant to dawn upon my soul. The torches dream, enwrapped in chrysolite and emerald. From arch and dome the light and laughter rise. My soul sinks buried in this vision splendorous. The softly fleeting violet evening light is happiness. The liturgical text of this epigraph is the ancient hymn recited on Saturday evening by Armenians called Kiramtits, the song of the beginning of Sunday, Luis Zavart, joyful light, Sur Paratsan Mahi, of the holy immortal glory of the Heavenly Father, holy maker of life. Jesus Christ, we've come at the setting of the sun and seen the light of this evening, and bless Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and all say Amen. Make us worthy in every hour to bless in voices of song the name of the glory of your Trinity, which gives life, on account of which this world too glorifies you. And a second poem, in the same spirit. Her tear drops with the dripping myrrh. My mother mixes in the censer. Passing through an unseen door, she listens, happy to a voice emerging from the other world. To the eyes that observe her Saturday evening incense, her hand ceaseless makes the sign of the cross. And to all she gives a portion of the ringing censer's flower smoke. And the eve of Sunday is a mirror where the ardent fire glows, of guardian angels, luminous in soul, whom this evening she has given to sip her tears and weekly incense smoke, and now my gray-haired mother bows. The guardian angels here are the Zevartunner, compare the phrase Luis Zavart that I mentioned, but the angels are called Lusahoki, of luminous soul. This is an epithet of the departed. So the rhyming collocation of chunk and artzunk, tears and incense, may reflect both ardent prayer and recollection of those departed to the other world, whom his mother sees. And as his mother swings the censer to give each member of the family a breath of its aroma, Misak hints at its sound as well as the appearance of the smoke and its aroma. Zuchen zachik madzapeli. Parur Savak probably had these lines in mind, by the way. He's the poet I mentioned earlier who died in 1971, about a loving mother's pure-hearted faith and its power, and the sounds and scent of Christian prayer, when he wrote a kind of protest poem called Chech Gadaka, the Jester, in 1962, Vordechen mernum polorsh kurkera, tzapu tzins chayi tzanrutyan nerko, Nayev Chunkerum. Where do all the idols die? In the Soviet Union, we knew exactly what he meant. Under the weight of applause and of symbols, and also in incense. Medzarents writes a homeland of sleeping skies, nocturnal revels, weeping dawns, angels peeking in from the other world at his mother's prayers, the sounds of cymbals, colors of rainbows, streaming silks. He wonders what a silkworm dreams. And in the cycle Elayi, would that I were, he creates an embracing liturgy of his own. Would I were this evening to touch every passerby's brow, lovely, languorously to linger. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening filled with human song and bird song and the elements' clamorous heartbeat. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening lazy, charming, gauzy, rosy, smelling, undulant as a gold-brocaded curtain, every soul sheltering. Would I were this evening dense with the bell's clangor that strides upon heaven, as an incense-dim chapel anointed, torch-litten. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening tranquil to give to the waning lamp of a dying girl new flame from my shining. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening filled with the oceanic waters, heavy booming, and with the blossom of the breeze's melody. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening that on daybreak's pearly pillow fades, tossing its gorgeous tresses streaming. Would I were this evening. Would I were this evening resplendent, universal, sweet, bestowing upon all my shining locks fire and gold. Would I were this evening. And even broken in sickness, his spirit imagines only light. In the poem Arevin, to the sun, with the gentle and full-voiced wind from the south, so like a kiss, though dreamed of long ago, it fills my lovelorn soul with pleasure. Sun, shine on, your arrows tinged with gold, upon my birth pangs muffled by the fog, there where thought lingers and has lost its way. Shine on, good sun, for I am sick, plunging madly in the fluid casement's breast for the noon's embrace, lush green, dream, fire-bound, I attend with outstretched arms. Spin round me all your nets of flame and rock me in your heat until, locked in your kiss, consuming, burning, the drowsy children rise and file out of my soul, that I may rise and tread anew my ardent paths of sensuous delight. I'm sick, good sun, shine on, shine on. My soul is a bird, it longs for laughing song and air and light, but the trill that takes wing from its depths on steps o'ershadowed and unseen. This, by the way, he takes from the poem Durdunshk by Torren, is short of breath. I mean, he's dying of consumption. It plummets down. Shine, good sun, for I am sick. In your flaring, effortlessly roused, long as the wild, fierce hornet's antic hay whirls on, drunken with your flame, till thirsting leaf expire, blossom, fade, I drink this restful day, its nameless pleasures, slothful, sentient, intoxicant, luxuriant, just a little longer. Good sun, shine on, for I am sick. For one last time, cleave to my impassioned soul, it burns with fire. I'm sick, good sun, shine and shine. This is a poem I think Zjarents might have had in mind when in 1920 he wrote one of his most important poems, Mahvan Desil, The Vision of Death, which uses the expressive words marmarel, and the phrase marmroch yev marmaroch irigvamech, and porp, fire. In porp yergir, my land of fire, lusapsako abakan, your future crowned with, diademed with light that stand out here too. Both poems are pleas in extremis. And Medzarents draws from the language and gestures of prayer. The line Teva daradzgas basem, arms outstretched, I wait, evokes a line from the Narek that he cites in his article Naregatsi Inhead, together with Naregatsi, Aha garkarem skarkam yal bazukas hogvuis hanun kohezor. Now I stretch wide my soul's bending arms to you, Almighty One. Naregatsi is full of these things. He says, Teves daradz yalar tzvuinorinaga vungalarazna. He speaks of Moses. You stretched out your arms like eagles and received him. Or he says, Dzeren hambarnam daradz mampazgatsis. I hold up my hands and stretch my arms out. Haitzem bazgataraz. We beg with arms outstretched. Machtanat skochman pezutian, sobbing in our supplications. And I just made a list of all the places where this is used, and you can imagine that Medzarents sees prayer not only as a supplication of God, but as an embrace of the world. The final poem I'd like to present, as you'll be happy to hear, is the one I believe is his Ars Poetica. In Sharpetsutiamp, with what intoxication. It was printed, as I noted, less than a year before his death, and was dedicated to a friend who was to be murdered. The poem deploys every gorgeous alliterative cadence, every intricacy of verbal invention, every extravagance of imagery, every incantatory rhythm its author had honed and gathered and cherished. You find in it the narod, the marital diadem, the folk song word for loveliness, chorod, the green of the crowns of trees is dzovadzup, sea wave tossing, and the plain's majesty is dzirani. There's a catalog of herbs, basmapurum, with crowding multitudes of their aromas. And at the end, as all elements and beings join a dance, together they experience what he calls an andratarts ziatsanum, a reflecting, returning rainbowness That is the poet bidding farewell, his soul reaching up from all, a graceful arc composed of color, light, and dew, to touch the face of heaven, but then once again return to embrace the earth. In its pantheistic intoxication, its unashamed love, its elemental exultation and delight, the poem stands as a testament and inheritance. It's a clarion of the Armenian language and literature. The reason we study these things, the reason that the subject has to continue, the reason that small languages have a right to live. It's the victory of a free spirit from an unconquered land. What is, in the end, that light, we're told, that shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not, but the light that comes from within the soul, especially the soul of a creative being? This poem I want to read in Armenian as well. So if you'll give me a second, I'll get the text out. And then I'll read the English. Ինչ արպեցությամբ ծարեր, լույսին մեջ ծարեր, հովին մեջ, և անձրևներուն վարսավոր ծարեր, ծարեր երկնուխեշ, ու ծարեր մատաղ, ծովաձուպ կանանչ, ծորենի ցանքին գոքնին կած շվարուն, ամենն ալ կյանքին կմպեն հոր ճանճանչ, ինչ արպեցությամբ խոտն որ հողենվեր գել է, ըզմայլուն գբանա լույսին վարկյան մաբրող իր ցողե աչքեր, ինչ արպեցությամբ ծաղիկներ շաղին, ծաղիկներ լուսին, մտերիմ ձերքին, սպասումներուն մեջ կնվաղին, ինչ արպեցությամբ ամեն մեկ արոտ, ամեն մեկ պլրակ, իր գանանչ ճակտին կկապե երբնած ծաղիկեն արոտ, ինչ արպեցությամբ տաշտերեն խորոտ և հարս հվտեն գարմրոտանի գարնարակիլ նիրտարցին գարոտ, ինչ արպեցությամբ Սարյակներն արտուն լույսն գծծեն, մրկաստաներու մեջ են սաղարտուն, ինչ արպեցությամբ ձյուն ժայեր, ձպին բարձրեն օդաջեմ լյուխ կուքան, արպին մեջ կոսկեզոտ զին ու գթև անան, ինչ արպեցությամբ տատրակն հարսենի, արագաստրա ծարի հովանին, գսպասե տարպոտ իր վարուժանին, ինչ արպեցությամբ թիթերն է պացեր, լլակի մանրիկ լիչին վրա պրպրուն, արագաստաշեն իր կատ թևիկներ, ինչ արպեցությամբ ձիրանի դաշտեն շեք ծաղիկներուն գվազե մեղուն, ձծել իգայի պտխունքներն հեշտին, ինչ արպեցությամբ ծովերն են կապույտ, կետերն հորտաջուշ, աղբյուրներ զեղուն, լիջեր խաժագույն, արուն շուտապույտ, լորածամ արուն որգանցնի քովեն, ուրստաներու գեջ, լսնակապույտ, ինչ արպեցությամբ ամպեր գթոթվեն, հրաշալի հեղուկն իրենց ըստին խին ու զերտ աստխանի վար, գսողոսկի մարելու երկրին պասուկը ոսկի, ինչ արպեցությամբ զայն գուշտ խխմեն համակրավ դաբեն, սարսատած հողին ծնուտներն ամեն, ծաղկտիկներն ամեն, ինչ արպեցությամբ հոգին կնդքրգե ալյակն հորտահոս, ձայրի իբույրին, զոտրին, անանուխ, վայրի, ռեհանի, պազմապուրումները նստաշ խուխունկե, ինչ արպեցությամբ կնդքրգե անի, բոլոր ձևերն ու երանքներն ամեն, բոլոր գոյությանց, բոլոր տարերուն, իր մեջ անդրադարձ, ձիածանում են աստված, որեկավ, չես գիտեր ուրգե. How drunken the trees in the light, trees in the wind and in the rain, shaggy tressed trees, trees that to the heavens strain, and saplings green and tossing, crests like sea waves, tumbling to the bosom of the wheat fields in a daze. All life is drunken on the sun's abundant blaze. In what intoxication the grass above the dark soil rises, opens to the light amazed, and the instant of its life, the dewdrops of its eyes. How drunken are the flowers in the dew, flowers in the light, at ease beneath the hand's caress, are swooning now in expectation, with what intoxication every hillock on its green brow binds the blossom's multicolored nuptial diadem, and from the lovely plain and dale the redfoot stork now guides his bride, returning home imbibes his longing satiation. With what intoxication blackbirds drink the light and whisper it alert in orchards' leafy fastnesses. With what intoxication the snow-white jays afloat on high sail, perambulate upon the sky, taking wing, their bodies gilded on the glowing firmament. With such intoxication the turtle dove her nuptial bed arranges in the shady bower of a tree for her swain in patient passion. The drunken butterfly unfolds upon the tiny sparkling lakelet of its leaf, and with its milky wings erects its canopy. With that intoxication, above the purple plain to scarlet flowers hies the bee to suck upon the tiny female nipples luxuriant. In their drunkenness the seas brim blue, the river waters surge, the streams are spilling, the rivulets purl swiftly, lakes azure, the brook, his waves green-fronded tossing, slips between the willows' pale lunar limbs. The drunken clouds now shake their shaggy heads, the wondrous liquid massing in their breasts, and like a snaking thread the rain descends to slake the hot gold thirst of earth. With that intoxication, drink their fill upon the parched soil's universal burn, all creatures born, all flowers grown. Drunk the wave laps in embrace the perfumed tree, thyme and mint and basil growing wild and storax, frankincense, aromas teeming, are embracing, drunken everything. All shapes and forms, all colors gleaming, all essences and elements. He, whose rainbow everything reflects, returning, God, who from God knows where has come to them. Thank you.
Thank you. That is one fascinating talk. Thank you very much. I would like to make an announcement. We have 2 microphones for the question-answer session, except I will need 2 volunteers. Mark, would you please? Christian, would you please? Microphones are back there. Yes, please.
Could I give somebody a few quarters to feed the meter?
That's right. That's true. You're right. Yeah. So we have about, I guess we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. Please, all yours.
I don't know, philological question after that sort of torrent of its inspiration. I was just wondering about Medzarents' acquaintance with Poe at the turn of the 20th century. If you think it's more likely that he would have read Baudelaire's translation of Poe in French.
He knew English.
I'm wondering about the availability of the editions, in a way. What's more likely to have been available?
What we know about Poe in general is that Baudelaire's essay on Poe is what made him known to the world. I think Medzarents actually learned some English before he learned French. Okay. So it's quite possible that he read Poe in English. Yeah? Balmont in Russia, this isn't an evasion. Balmont in Russia read Poe in French and translated the bells into Russian from French, and they come out better, in my view, they come out much better than the original. No, much better, and Rachmaninoff then wrote his symphony about the bells, while in America nobody did anything with them until Phil Oakes wrote a folk song about them in the 60s. So I think he read Poe in English. If he read it in French, it was no loss. Yeah. But that's the most we know.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am extremely pleased to say we have some refreshments waiting for us, and thank you very much for coming. Have a good night. Thank you very much. So we have refreshments and drinks.